UK. What happens when two of the world's most famous brothers stand under the same roof again after years of silence, without cameras, without protocol, without prepared remarks? This was precisely the question on everyone's mind when Prince William and Prince Harry met on January 20th, in a secluded chapel on the Sandringham estate. It wasn't an official engagement, not a symbolic act of the crown, but a quiet, highly sensitive event that immediately captured global attention. Because the meeting wasn't political, not representative. It was deeply personal and emotionally charged. The announcement came quietly, almost casually, yet a single hint was enough to set the rumor mill churning. An internal memo, labeled simply Private Royal Schedule, indicated that something extraordinary was about to happen. For the first time in almost 4 years, the two brothers were to stand face to face with one another. The location was deliberately chosen. A private chapel, far removed from the public eye and the press, accessible only to a select group of people with a direct connection to Princess Diana. This fact alone made it clear that this wasn't about reconciliation in the classical sense, but about something deeper. A palpable nervousness pervaded the royal household. Staff were reduced to a minimum, communication channels restricted, and all forms of documentation forbidden. There were no cameras, no official photographers, no prepared statements. Experienced palace insiders described the atmosphere as more tense than ever before, for this meeting was not a calculated PR stunt, but an uncontrollable clash of two lives that had diverged over the years. When the chapel doors opened shortly after 11 a.m., there was no sign of royal pomp. No applause, no ceremony, only silence. Prince William entered the room first, followed by Prince Harry a few moments later. The brief encounter of their eyes was enough to make the emotional weight of the moment tangible. There was neither an embrace nor any demonstrative gestures, but neither was there any turning away. In an environment otherwise characterized by strict formality, this restraint alone was considered a remarkable step. For months, speculation about a possible meeting had dominated the headlines. Some observers considered a rapprochement impossible. Others suspected a carefully staged show of unity. But the reality in that chapel left no doubt that something else was at stake. This meeting was intended neither for the crown nor for the public. It was a moment that revolved solely around one central figure, Princess Diana. Her name, her memory, and her legacy hung unspoken over the entire gathering. Paradoxically, the absence of their mother, who had shaped both brothers, was the unifying element. In the years of public disputes, interviews, and distance, it had become clear how differently they had coped with this loss. Now, it was precisely this shared pain that brought them back to the same place. Even shortly after the meeting, it became clear that a single moment within the chapel had fundamentally altered the atmosphere. A brief address by Prince William, which focused not on past conflicts but on the memory of Princess Diana, is said to have redefined the emotional landscape. For many observers, this was the decisive turning point. Instead of old recriminations, a shared history suddenly came to the fore, one that ran deeper than any public controversy. The symbolism of this meeting was undeniable. Two brothers whose relationship had been considered fractured for years came together not out of duty or tradition, but because of a mother whose influence remains unbroken even decades after her death. This very premise made the moment so explosive and so significant. For if there was a force strong enough to break through the hardened fronts, it was the memory of Princess Diana. What did this quiet reunion truly mean? Was it the beginning of genuine change or merely an emotional pause? And could a single meeting be enough to overcome years of distance? These questions extend far beyond the walls of the chapel and mark the starting point of a story that had only just begun. What followed fundamentally changed the nature of the meeting. Up to that point, the gathering had been characterized by reserve, tension, and unspoken expectations. But then the focus shifted abruptly. Not old conflicts, not public accusations, and not the years of distance between them suddenly took center stage, but rather a theme that inextricably linked both brothers: the memory of their mother. The moment Prince William began to refer to Princess Diana, the atmosphere transformed from cautious defensiveness to quiet attentiveness. Observers later described this turn as completely unexpected. Instead of rehashing the past of recent years, William brought to the forefront a time long before the current tensions. The recollection of shared childhood experiences, early formative experiences, and the values Diana had instilled in her sons created a new emotional framework. The space previously filled with distance became a place of shared past. This was precisely where the explosive power of the moment lay. William presented Diana not as an icon or a myth, but as a formative figure in their everyday lives. He recalled situations in which she had instilled in her son closeness, compassion, and a sense of responsibility. The emphasis on empathy and service to others came particularly to the fore. This shifted the focus away from institutional issues and toward personal principles. For many present, this was the first clear indication that this meeting was not about formal reconciliation, but about an emotional realignment. These words acted as a catalyst. The years of silence between the brothers had created a void that was now suddenly filled, not with justification, but with shared memories. William made it clear that the distance of the past years would not have been in their mother's best interest. Without making accusations, he painted a picture of a shared responsibility that both brothers held despite their different paths in life. The effect of this passage was immediately palpable: a concentrated silence, less defensive than contemplative. In an environment otherwise defined by clear hierarchies, a moment of equality emerged. The memory of Diana served as a unifying element that transcended personal hurt. It became the yardstick by which decisions, silence, and distance were re-evaluated. Media outlets that later reported on this period spoke of a turning point, not because of spectacular gestures, but because of the clarity of the message. William had created a framework in which the focus was no longer on assigning blame, but on their shared heritage. This very shift made the moment so significant. It opened up the possibility of understanding the past not as a dividing line, but as a shared origin. Particularly striking was William's deliberate avoidance of current controversies. Neither institutional conflicts nor external influences played a role. Instead, the sole question was how far both brothers had drifted from the values they once shared. This indirect self-reflection lent his words additional credibility and amplified their impact. The memory of Diana thus became a moral reference point. It served not as a means of nostalgia, but as a source of orientation. At that moment, it became clear that the meeting was not only retrospective but also forward-looking. William signaled that the past could not be changed, but how it was dealt with could. This was precisely the provocation of his appearance. For Harry, this turn of events meant a new starting point. Instead of being confronted with old accusations, he suddenly stood before a shared memory that required no defense. The question was no longer who had been right, but whether both were prepared to acknowledge their mother's legacy as a unifying element. Thus, the focus of the meeting shifted from confrontation to self-examination. But was this emotional opening more than a one-off moment? Could the memory of Diana truly be strong enough to overcome years of distance? Or was it merely a brief moment of closeness that could not resolve the underlying conflict? It was precisely this uncertainty that made the moment so explosive and kept the world watching with bated breath to see what would happen next. After the initial shift in mood, the meeting gained a new depth. What had previously seemed like a cautious approach evolved into a moment of self-examination. Prince William now focused more intently on his own role and drew attention to inner conflicts that had remained hidden for years. This was not about justification, but about admitting that silence itself had become a form of action. At the heart of it all was the realization that a sense of duty and reticence do not always guarantee protection. William made it clear how much the expectation of maintaining stability and preserving the institution from upheaval had weighed on him. This attitude had influenced decisions for years and led to closeness being replaced by distance. In this context, the meeting in the chapel seemed like a break with a long-established pattern. Particularly poignant was the insight that his own silence had unintended consequences. The reticence, which had been understood as loyalty to the crown, had, in retrospect, proven to be an obstacle. Instead of diffusing conflicts, it had exacerbated them. This self-criticism lent the moment a new seriousness and underscored that it wasn't just about family tensions, but about fundamental questions of responsibility and leadership. William also reflected on the inner conflict between his personal feelings and his public role. As the future king, he had been trained to control his emotions and weigh decisions strategically. Yet it was precisely this discipline that had prevented closeness at crucial moments. The meeting revealed how deeply this inner tension had plagued him for years and how profoundly it had affected his relationship with his brother. Another key aspect was the role of fear. The concern about jeopardizing existing structures had led to a deadlock that was only now being openly acknowledged. This fear was not only personal but also institutional. It reflected the burden that comes with the expectation of ensuring continuity at all costs. The admission of this fear marked a turning point because it revealed the human dimension behind the public facade. References to the past played a crucial role in this. Memories of earlier years, when openness and exchange had been taken for granted, highlighted the contrast with the subsequent silence. William realized that the loss of this openness had not been abrupt, but gradual. This very realization lent the meeting a particular gravity, as it demonstrated how easily closeness can be lost if it is not actively cultivated. It became clear to those present that this moment was more than a family discussion. It held symbolic significance for how leadership is understood within the monarchy. William's willingness to engage in self-criticism was interpreted as a signal that future decisions could be characterized by greater transparency and reflection. This perspective carried a significance that extended far beyond the personal. At the same time, uncertainty remained as to how lasting this openness would be. A single meeting cannot undo years of distance. However, taking responsibility for his own silence fundamentally altered the dynamic. It created space for a dialogue that had previously seemed impossible, and paved the way for a response that was now inevitable. The question hanging in the air was clear. Would this self-disclosure be met with understanding, or would it create new tensions? And could the admission of personal failings truly serve as the starting point for a fresh start? With this expectation running high, all eyes turned to Prince Harry, whose reaction would be crucial in determining whether this moment would go down in history as a turning point or a missed opportunity. After Prince William's self-disclosure, the emotional focus of the meeting inevitably shifted to Prince Harry. Attention was focused on his posture, his body language, and whether the years of distance would be reinterpreted in this moment. What followed was not an outburst, not a dramatic rebuttal, but a controlled, thoughtful response that further altered the tone of the entire meeting. Prince Harry initially remained reserved. Observers described a tense silence that underscored the weight of the moment. The years of tension, the public debates, and the personal decision to break away from the constraints of the monarchy seemed to be concentrated in that instant. His reaction was marked by seriousness and a visible effort to gain clarity. Instead of rehashing old wounds, he focused on the common ground the two brothers shared. At the heart of it all was once again the memory of Princess Diana. For Harry, she was always more than a historical figure or a public symbol. She remained an emotional point of reference that had significantly shaped his decisions and his self-understanding. This perspective lent his reaction a particular depth. Instead of defending or downplaying the distance of the past years, he made it clear that it had stemmed from a feeling of being overwhelmed and misunderstood. The decision to distance himself was thus interpreted not as a break, but as a defense mechanism. This reframing noticeably changed the dynamic of the meeting. The focus shifted from questions of blame to mutual understanding. Harry revealed that his distance had not been directed against his brother, but against an environment in which he had increasingly felt alienated. This created a nuanced picture that offered no easy explanations and instead highlighted the complexity of personal decisions. Particularly striking was the revisiting of early childhood memories. These moments, far removed from public scrutiny, illustrated how deeply Diana had instilled a sense of security in both her sons. For Harry, this memory became the antithesis of his later experiences with the media, public pressure, and institutional expectations. The contrast between these worlds explained why his approach to loss and responsibility had taken a different path than his brother's. The effect of this response was immediate. The previously palpable tension gave way to a cautious rapprochement. It seemed that both brothers were, for the first time, ready not only to hear each other's perspective but also to accept it. This moment did not mark an end, but an opening. The distance had not disappeared, but it had softened. At the same time, the situation remained fragile. Acknowledging each other's motives did not automatically mean reconciliation. The experiences of the past years ran too deep, and the paths they had taken were too different. Nevertheless, it became clear that their shared memory of Diana served as a connecting element, enabling dialogue without reopening old wounds. For outsiders, this moment took on particular significance because it painted a new picture of Prince Harry. Instead of appearing as the antithesis of the monarchy, he emerged as someone who had found his own way of dealing with grief and responsibility. This portrayal contradicted prevailing narratives and added another dimension to the meeting. It was no longer about differences, but about different expressions of the same loss. At the end of this period, a central question remained. Is the mutual understanding sufficient to overcome the distance in the long term? Or will it remain a moment of closeness that could fade again in the daily grind of obligations? And what role will the memory of Princess Diana play in the future? As a lasting bridge, or as a silent witness to a brief moment of rapprochement? As soon as the meeting became public, a dynamic unfolded outside the chapel that surprised even seasoned observers. Within a few hours, a strictly private moment transformed into a global topic of conversation. Media outlets, social networks, and political commentators reacted almost simultaneously. The focus was less on the formal details of the meeting than on its emotional impact. The public immediately registered that this was not a routine meeting, but a break with established patterns. Initial reactions painted a picture of cautious hope. Many saw the meeting as a sign that even entrenched conflicts within the monarchy were not irreversible. Particularly striking was the tone of numerous comments, which described the moment as humanly vulnerable and surprisingly honest. At a time when public institutions are often perceived as distant, this openness struck a chord. But parallel to the wave of sympathy, nervousness grew behind palace walls. It quickly became clear that this meeting was not entirely controllable. Every sentence, every gesture, even the silences, were interpreted and disseminated. Within a few hours, internal consultations began to assess the impact on the overall image of the monarchy. The challenge was to neither suppress the emotional response nor allow it to spiral out of control. Official communication remained accordingly restrained. Short, factual statements were intended to signal that this was a family matter, without attributing any political or institutional significance to it. This restraint was deliberate. Too much closeness could have been interpreted as strategic staging, too much distance as rejection. The fine line between these extremes made the situation particularly delicate. Meanwhile, commentators analyzed the potential consequences. Some saw the meeting as a turning point for the public image of the monarchy. Others warned against excessive expectations. The past had shown that symbolic moments do not necessarily lead to lasting change. Nevertheless, the impression remained that something fundamental had been set in motion, not because of official declarations, but because of the emotions that had surfaced. The event was also followed closely internationally. The response extended far beyond Great Britain and reflected a global interest in family conflicts at the intersection of tradition and modernity. Many reactions expressed the hope that personal openness could counterbalance institutional rigidity. This interpretation took on a significance that transcended national borders. At the same time, critical voices grew louder. Skeptics questioned whether the moment could have long-term consequences or whether it would merely go down in history as an isolated event. The memory of previous attempts at rapprochement, which had failed to have a lasting impact, fueled doubts. Yet even this skepticism helped to maintain attention and deepen the discourse. Within the palace, the situation remained tense. Every further development, every public perception, had to be reassessed. The meeting had demonstrated that personal narratives can be more powerful than strategic communication. Therein lay both the risk and the potential of this moment. The question was no longer whether it was significant, but rather what direction that significance would take. At the end of this section, a realization hung in the air. The public reaction had made clear how much many yearned for authenticity. But could the monarchy meet this expectation without jeopardizing its stability? And was this moment a singular emotional high point or the prelude to a more profound transformation? As the immediate reaction subsided, a more fundamental question came to the fore. What significance did this meeting hold for the future of the monarchy and for the two brothers themselves? What initially seemed like a purely familial moment increasingly developed into a symbol of a potential shift in direction. At the heart of this interpretation was once again Princess Diana, whose influence, even decades after her death, was perceived as a unifying force. The meeting made it clear that her legacy could be not only a memory but also a source of guidance. Both brothers had pursued different paths over the years, yet their motivations stemmed from the same source. This realization gave the moment a new depth. Diana no longer appeared as a silent icon of the past, but as an active point of reference for the present and future. This very shift shaped the discussions in the days that followed. Particularly striking was the change in the perception of Prince William. His willingness to engage in self-reflection was interpreted as a signal that future leadership decisions could be characterized by greater openness. In an environment traditionally characterized by reserve, this was seen as a remarkable development. Observers viewed it as an indication that the monarchy could, in the long term, become more human and accessible without losing its institutional stability. Prince Harry, too, was reassessed. Instead of appearing as a permanent counterpoint, he now emerged as part of a shared narrative shaped by different expressions of the same values. This perspective opened the possibility of reassessing his role, not as a break, but as an alternative continuation of a legacy shared by both brothers. This reassessment took on additional significance. At the same time, the future remained open. No one could guarantee that this moment would lead to a lasting rapprochement. The experiences of the past years were too profound, the structural framework too complex. Yet the meeting had demonstrated that dialogue is possible when shared values form the starting point. This realization alone fundamentally altered the initial situation. In the following weeks, the impression intensified that Diana was acting as a bridge. Events, initiatives, and public appearances related to her work once again came into focus. The symbolism was unmistakable. Her name became the connecting element, linking personal stories and institutional responsibility. This development retrospectively acquired strategic significance, even if it was not originally intended as such. In the end, there was no conclusion, but rather an open process. The meeting didn't provide definitive answers, but rather raised new questions. This was precisely its strength. It forced all involved to reconsider entrenched narratives and allow room for development. Whether this space would be used remained an open question. The central question now was, can Princess Diana's legacy serve as a lasting unifying force? Or will this moment remain a rare glimmer in an otherwise distanced history? And what does it mean for an institution when humanity suddenly proves stronger than tradition? The answers to these questions will shape the coming years. The secret meeting between Prince William and Prince Harry marked a rare moment in which personal memory resonated more powerfully than public roles. In a secluded chapel, there was no formal reconciliation, but rather an emotional realignment. The focus on Princess Diana fundamentally altered the dynamics. Instead of old conflicts, shared values and common heritage came to the fore. William's self-reflection, his silence on duty and fear, opened up a new space for understanding. His willingness to take responsibility for the missed opportunity for closeness was interpreted as a signal of a possible shift in leadership. Harry's reaction, marked by thoughtfulness and a return to shared memories, completed this picture. The distance of the past years was not denied, but placed in a broader context. The public response showed how much many yearn for authenticity. At the same time, The nervousness within the palace made it clear how challenging emotional openness can be for a tradition-bound institution. The meeting thus became a symbol of the tension between humanity and continuity. In the end, there was no final result, but rather an open perspective. Diana became a bridge, not a point of contention. Her legacy offered a common point of reference. The dialogue was possible without reopening old wounds. Whether this moment will lead to a lasting rapprochement remains to be seen. What is certain, however, is that the story of the two brothers has been reframed, not as an endless conflict, but as a process based on shared values. What does this development mean for the future of the monarchy? And how much space should humanity occupy in a system that thrives on tradition? These questions will remain, and therein lies the lasting impact of this meeting.